I did tell a few people I'd be coming live 8 a.m. this morning on a special edition video because I feel compelled to speak at some length at what has been going on in the Rachel Reeves situation as the Chancellor of our Exchequer in the UK at the moment. So we'll have a little bit of a roundup first of all. Labour were elected on the 4th of July 2024. It was always very clear Rachel Reeves was going to be the Chancellor. She was installed as Keir Starmer's shadow Chancellor, booting out Annalise Dodds, who, if you remember, John McDonnell, who was Jeremy Corbyn's right-hand man and a self-proclaimed Marxist, who was the shadow Chancellor. Annalise Dodds was John McDonnell's protege, if you like. So it was a good day when we saw her booted out of contention to be the next Chancellor, when we suspected back then, as we did, that Labour might win the election. So they did win the election. They won on the back of some silly promises, as often happens. And the reason why it was particularly silly is because they didn't need to promise anything like they did in order to win that election. They told some silly stories about tax that were just flagrantly untrue. They knew they were untrue. They knew they'd have to put taxes up. And so it came to pass that they did. So mistakes really definitely included taking too long to set the date for the budget, and then the budget date then being set too far out. So all this allowed was basically speculation to kick in. And speculation means freezing of investment. And this slowed the economy down. So in 2024, Q1 and Q2, we grew 0.7 and 0.5 respectively in real terms, 1.2% plus a little bit of compounding there, of course, as well. In half a year, that's exceptional growth for the UK these days. Now, don't get me wrong, quite a bit of this was catching up on what hadn't happened between 22 and the start of 24. Part of it was catching up on the debacle that had happened before. Part of it was catching up on the fact that ultimately GDP is measured after inflation, and inflation had been so high, and we had a dramatic drop in inflation in those first few months of 2024, which helped massively inflate those GDP figures. But nonetheless, we did get that growth. We could talk about why. You know, we had a pretty sensible Chancellor in Jeremy Hunt. And whilst Sunak was politically particularly weak, we all knew that he was financially savvy. He'd already proven that he was financially savvy in more ways than one. Certainly in terms of his personal net worth, but also when he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer himself. He did a pretty passable job, even if he did miss one of the great opportunities of all time to borrow money in the long term at 0% and invest it in infrastructure in UK PLC. A real shame that he didn't do that in 2021. But there we go. It's a pity that he wasn't listening to those who were saying that ultimately the economy and interest rates were probably going to have to go up because inflation was coming. But never mind. Can't have it all, can you? So Rachel Reeves in number 11 Downing Street delivered that budget October the 30th. It was a bit of a surprise kick in the teeth for business. We did kind of know a few days before, as things started to leak out, she was going to break a manifesto commitment of not raising national insurance and try and get around it by saying, well, we meant national insurance on workers because we said workers wouldn't pay more tax. A little bit naughty to say the least, but ultimately a tax on employing people, and make no mistake, that's what employers' national insurance is. Increasing the cost of employing people, ultimately very, very simple economics. Pretty much anyone who's ever been in anywhere near economics would tell you this. Make it more expensive to employ them, fewer people will be employed. Fewer people than otherwise would have been employed, right? Cost goes up, demand goes down. Simple fact of the matter. Few more companies go bust than they otherwise would have done. Then you combine that with certain things such as taking the discount on the business rates down, and that effectively means the business rates increase for a lot of businesses of around 65%. And the worst bit is a lot of these businesses are the businesses that are under the most pressure already. Retail, which is struggling, but struggles more with the minimum wage that's put up. So minimum wage up 6.7, but ultimately cost of employing a minimum wage full-time member of staff after the marginal fourth member of staff, because of the changes they've made to these national insurance employers' thresholds. And note, that's not the same as changing the rates. That's the rate plus the threshold change. So anyone employing more than four full-time equivalent minimum wage staff will also pay more in national insurance anyway. So you add up all these costs together, I've done the maths, comes to about 10.75% increase in the cost of staff. seriously damaging when prices aren't going up anywhere near as much as they were. And of course, it is inflationary. It will push prices up as well. So there's an argument that all this money that's been raised by Rachel Reeves' raid, which was 25 billion headline, but then 5 billion was coming from the private sector. 4 billion was going to come off corporation tax bills, because of course companies will make less profit, so they pay less corporation tax, and you were at 16 billion. Right, but if you lose that 16 billion because you lose it in revenue because you stop growing the economy, you pay it out in benefits because more people are unemployed, you lose it because businesses don't invest because they've got no confidence to invest because they don't know where these tax rises stop, then ultimately it ends up being counterproductive. And that happens so often with tax. It's kind of nudging pieces around a chessboard and things like that. But the primary focus that I wanted to put on today's video was the nonsense that I've seen being propagated and the chink of light in the door that Elizabeth Truss has seen in being able to vindicate herself for saying, I didn't do that bad a job in 2022. Yes, you did, Liz. You did a terrible job. And the primary reason for that, which for some reason we seem to be forgetting, or your supporters are absolutely unwilling to talk about, is the fact that you thought you could ignore the rule book and the checks and balances. So, little bit of revision. The UK economy owes about £2.7 trillion in national debt. And you often think, who does it owe it to? Right now, some of it owes to itself. It owes to the Bank of England, ultimately funded by the Treasury. So there's a little bit of a circle there of, let's just call it an interesting web of things that doesn't really exist, but it works on paper. And the system does work as long as it's kept under control. But forget about the Bank of England for the moment. Who owns the rest of it? Ultimately, UK institutions and investors, individuals, and then institutions abroad. And if they think they're going to get a good return on their money, and what do they think about? Well, they think about the return they're going to get, the interest rate. Now, remember, the very short-term interest rate is set by the Bank of England, 4.75% at the moment. But the market, the international gilt markets, set the rest of the yield curve, really, using that 4.75 as their starter position. So you might have seen, for example, the headline, highest yield since 1998. Aside from anything else, that's been one of the popular headlines in the past week or so. That's on the 30-year bonds. So what the investors are saying is, in the long run, we think the UK government isn't in a strong position, is going to struggle to grow, is going to need to do something different, whether that's some kind of write-down, bailout, devaluation. You know, we're starting to get towards the level there where they're betting on that sort of outcome, the bond vigilantes, as they call them. But there are people who own our debt all over the world, and ultimately they are taking a position on the UK. They've got to consider the returns. They've also got to consider, or they're betting on the strength or not of the currency. So sterling is in a unique position in the world whereby it was the world's reserve currency going around about 85 years ago. It ceded control of that to the dollar ultimately. And then when it ceded control of that to the dollar, it meant it would have to pull back over the years. It would devalue over a longer period of time, relatively slowly. And that's what we've seen from sterling. People will remember this, especially depending on your age. If you know anything about the UK currency, you'll know that it used to be far stronger against the Swiss franc, against the dollar, against any currency you pick, really. And there's been this sort of slow decompression of that currency. And the only other currency you could really compare that to, going back many years, is the guilder in Holland, as was back then when Holland was had the reserve currency. The reserve currency meaning everybody wants to hold that currency. You can pretty much use it anywhere in the world. And that's what the US dollar represents in today's world, right? So that's where we are. Now, with sterling slowly weakening, people want higher interest rates, because if you move your currency into a place where there's a decent interest rate, but it's devaluing against your home currency, if your home currency was the dollar, then you're not getting the returns that you look like you're getting, if that makes sense. Because if you exchange it at $1.30 ultimately, and then over time you're only getting back $1.10 for every pound, then you've obviously had a significant loss, nearly 20% in that differential in currency. So you do need to bear that in mind as well. And this is where international gilt investing is fairly complex. But this is the things that institutional investors are bearing in mind. And they're basically saying, look, we need quite a premium to lend money to the UK at the moment, right? But back to Liz Truss, we need to remember that what happened is very, very suddenly, by ignoring the rules that have been put in place, and let's remember, by a Conservative Chancellor, by George Osborne, not the most popular Chancellor, especially if you speak to the property and landlording community, like I do on a very regular basis, not popular at all because he changed the tax landscape, and many say he ruined things for UK property investors. I would probably say to you, he really ruined things for tenants, because it's created a much, much worse scenario than we had 10 years ago in housing, and we've got multiple problems that we're not dealing with. It's not all George's fault. There are multiple dynamics going on in that marketplace at the moment, but there we are. So Liz Truss thought it was okay to ignore the rules that one of her own chancellors, and one who served for a long time, had set 6 years worth in Downing Street, in number 11 Downing Street for George Osborne. And of course, what happens when you owe £2.7 trillion is markets go, I'm not sure I like this woman and her chancellor, because they don't seem to care about the rules. And when people who borrow money, lots of money, don't care about rules, the first thing the lenders are going to do is say, well, we're not lending you any more money, or we will, but the price is going up. Why does the price go up? Because the risk goes up so much. So Liz actually came in with a relatively low but rising bond yield market. So the gilts were paying sort of 2 to 2.5% at the time of the start of her premiership when she first came into power. So that's all it was costing the UK to borrow money, between 2 and 2.5%. Very, very quickly it rocketed up to 5%. Nearly overnight after that budget came in. It took about a week for that to happen. And it's the magnitude of that move, basically doubling the interest rate on UK debt. Now, it doesn't double it immediately because a lot of that debt is already set and out there, and it's gone out at a fixed interest rate. So it didn't double it immediately, but it did double the cost of taking on any new debt immediately. And countries like the UK, deficit nations as they're known, are always taking on new debt every day, week, month, right? They're taking on new debt because they're spending more than they bring in. And they can afford to do that because what's happening is they're betting on future growth in their economies, which obviously is an important point when you talk about growth before an election and then you don't deliver it, Rachel. But if we look at what Rachel Reeves has achieved, or not achieved is definitely the wrong word, but what's happened since the budget, we've seen more of a drift in the gilt yields of around about 1%, depending on where we are in the yield curve. So that's 3 months ago, 2.5 months ago now, and we've seen a move upwards of 1%. Reeves's problem is she started from a much higher base than Liz Truss did, but that's neither of their faults or to neither of their credits. They couldn't control what happened before they were in control. They can and should be held accountable for what they do while they are in control, right? But if Reeves has moved things 1% up in 2.5 months versus 2.5% up in a week, you can see the magnitude, I hope, of that difference. And that's why the Bank of England had to intervene. But now Liz Truss is coming back under covering fire saying, well, I did have the right ideas and the markets just didn't understand and it was all unfair and it was everybody else's fault but mine. Still never willing to admit that the most charitable you could possibly be is some of Liz Truss's policies were a good idea. They were horrifically communicated. You cannot go around just breaking the rules and having no respect for the system and the rules just because you want to call it the blob and it's the deep state and all these other things that she seems to have imported from a relatively lunatic side of American politics aside from anything else. There's a percentage of people on YouTube who will believe all that stuff is true, but it was widely documented. Liz Truss did not do detail, a bit like Boris, didn't know what she was doing economically. Whereas what Boris knew is what you need to do is talk to people positively, foster what John Maynard Keynes, famous economist, called animal spirits, or Boris's boosterism or whatever. And whatever you think of Boris Johnson, I think you would probably concede that he is someone who made people feel confident. He is someone who made people feel like they could invest money in the UK and things would be better. Now, whether they would have been better or not, well, it's difficult to say. I mean, remember, Boris's plans originally were for a 630 billion investment in UK infrastructure over the Parliament. That would have been magnificent. But, you know, he got elected on the 12th of December 2019 and a little virus was around there. And we know it was before the 31st of December 2019. But, of course, that's how it got its name. That's when it was first categorised. And, of course, as they say, the rest is history on that front. So we'll never know what would or could have happened. And instead, that money still pretty much got borrowed didn't get spent on infrastructure, got spent on repairing the economy after the pandemic, keeping the economy moving as much as possible. Of course, quite a lot of it got wasted. We know on things like track and trace and things like that, those sorts of things have been done to death. I think you would see Johnson as someone who probably did his best, but his competence was pushed to the limits. He saw himself as Winston Churchill, but in reality he was about as good as Churchill, the nodding dog, in these situations, because again, he relies on the people underneath him. And you could see that very much. Now, luckily, he had Sunak underneath him, who did do a creditable economic job. But Sunak was told the country didn't really want him, or more accurately, the Conservative Party didn't really want him, because they preferred Liz Truss's chat, and what they really preferred was lower taxes. The people who controlled the vote, the 100,000 people or so that voted Liz Truss in, wanted lower taxes at all costs. And that's such a silly, silly way of looking at things, because they didn't really mean that. They didn't really mean at all costs, because we nearly saw what all costs were. Huge increases in interest rates overnight, changing the way people's remortgages would work. And also what happened, of course, is banks also stopped lending for a short while, or many of them did, pulled products off the market and said, we can't set a price here for a product. We can't set a price because we've got no stability. Right? And that's the most damaging thing of all. That's what happened in a massive way, of course, in 2009. Right? So we have to consider that things could have been a lot worse. Luckily, that happened over a very short time window, because what happened is the Bank of England intervened. And they intervened to say those magic words that you need to say in what was a potential crisis situation: we will do whatever it takes. Because people know the strength, the might of the Bank of England, the fact they can print money, the fact they can intervene in bond markets as they see fit, makes a huge difference. Now, where we are today is nowhere near a case for intervention from the Bank of England just yet. We're in a place where it looks very grim for interest rates being cut this year, but this cycle does ebb and flow, and we need confidence. We need strong economic data, which would give us a little bit of confidence in that there will be some growth. And ideally, we could do with that good data before the 26th of March. The problem that we've got, apart from anything else, is that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer and the Labour Party believe that they're going to enact these policies that are going to be good for the long term or medium term future of the UK. Credit to Rachel Reeves, she did things in the budget which won't even benefit the UK during this Parliament. But I do believe that they will benefit the UK. Now, that's very, very rare in politics, because normally politicians will only do things that will benefit them in the now, right? So that's where they are. But even in this Parliament, they've already lost the trust and the respect and, you know, the love of the people, for sure. Now, the problem is they didn't have much in the first place, because what the Labour Party have refused to realise or not been able to see is that ultimately the people did not vote for the Labour Party, right? They voted against the Conservative Party, or they voted for change. So Keir Starmer was quite unpopular for an incoming Prime Minister before he'd done anything at all. The people were kind of like, yeah, pretty flat about him, but he looks all right. And we do know, of course, only a third of people who voted for Keir Starmer, and only 3 in 5 people voted. So only 20% of the people who could vote in the electorate, and they voted for Labour. So the other 80% either didn't vote or they voted for a different party. So that tells you where we were in the first place, and it also tells you the insanity of the first past the post system to an extent. But of course what happened is we had a surging forward party in Reform who split votes and things like that. And as we work on a first past the post basis, you needed fewer votes to get past that post, because you had another party taking quite a lot out of the pie. And the result was a huge Labour majority, as you know. And that's where we are. And this is why nothing's going to change until the next election. And there won't be another election, even if Keir Starmer was gone, even if Rachel Reeves was gone, etc., etc. So I'm running a live poll at the moment on LinkedIn and asking if Rachel Reeves should stay or go. Over 80% of people are suggesting that she should go. My advice would be careful what you wish for, because we don't want Annalise Dodds coming back, who was ultimately the protege of John McDonnell, as I said. We don't want John McDonnell coming back, for sure, although he has had the Labour whip removed, so we should be relatively safe there. But we don't have people waiting in the wings. So it would be impossible for Keir Starmer, really, politically, to sack Rachel Reeves and stay as head of the Labour Party himself. There'll be tons of people inside the Labour Party who wouldn't mind seeing him go because they think they could throw their hat in the ring. That's how politics works. You've just got knives in your back the whole time. So it's very unlikely he'd sack her. Then therefore she'd have to resign either on personal grounds or citing health or similar, which also looks unlikely. She spent her whole adult life and some of her childhood, by the sounds of it, dreaming of being the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and we're going to find out how resilient she is and how much she's up to the challenge at this point in time. There is no crisis. There are no reasons for people to be massively concerned about this whole thing, but there is a period of higher interest rates, not going down so much, inflation that's been added to by the budget that Rachel Reeves put out for the reasons that I've already explained. But when you raise the cost of employing people, then you're going to raise the cost of the end product, because that's how business works. They'll take some of the pain themselves, they'll pass some of the pain on to their customers. They're not going to absorb 100% of the pain. There's no chance of that happening. So that's where we are. And the bet, or the overall view, is that perhaps they will show some benefit over the course of this parliament and everything will be okay. The problem that I've got with that is I can only really claim to be an expert in one specific area, and that is the economics of the UK residential property market, right? And what I see in there, we've got quite a lot of noise, front foot manifesto policies. We're going to build 1.5 million homes. I don't really think you should take that literally, because they don't really mean the government, are going to build 1.5 million homes. I don't think they've ever pretended that that's the real target, right? What they've said is the UK as a country, that's the we will build 1.5 million homes over this parliament. So just to be clear, we built around 180,000, I think, homes in 2024. Now, obviously, Labour were in charge for 6 months of that, but they can't really take any credit or criticism for that, because there is a good 12-month lag time in delivering end products. But when you're looking at house building, you ultimately look at three things. You look at how many housing starts there are, so how many projects have actually been started to build, how much planning permission has been granted, because that's going to give you a further look into the future. And then you're going to look at completions, because for whatever reason, not every start gets to completion, but you've got a pretty good idea from the starts where the completions will be. And all of those metrics are down, right, in 2024, some of them significantly down, and are expected to go down again in 2025. And there's multiple reasons for that, some of which Labour have not been responsible for or known anything about. So, for example, changes in the Building Safety Act, right, changes in building regulations, meaning much more money needs to go into the ground at the start. I heard one house builder quoted £8,000 extra per house that they're building is needing to go in due to changes in 2023 building regulations. Of course, all of this was done by the Conservative government, and one of the reasons probably that angered so many Conservative voters, because all these extra regulations are not historically Conservative. It's much more Liz Truss popular conservatism, as it's now being called, that would see regulation being cut. But there has to be an understanding of we're back to the basics of economics again. If you make things more expensive to do, they'll either have to be more expensive to buy, and or there will be fewer of them delivered. And that's exactly what's happening in housing. Now, if you were going to deliver, and the gap is somewhere in the tune of 500,000 or 600,000 social homes over the time period, that would need funding, right? And I mean big funding. That would need, I've seen figures quoted, you certainly need something in the order of 125 billion or so, perhaps 150 billion to build all those homes, right? Possibly a bit more, because it's also, of course, like it always is, building them where they're needed, not just building them somewhere. That's the sort of subsidy needed to produce that housing. Now, it might not be the worst thing in the world, actually, stay with me, to borrow that money, right? Because ultimately, if that money isn't borrowed, if those homes aren't delivered, then those people are going in an alarming rate into temporary accommodation. They're claiming housing benefit elsewhere from the state to house them in the private rental sector for the few PRS landlords that will provide housing benefit tenancies and all the rest of it, apart from anything else, just because affordability knocks people out. It's again widely thought it's discrimination. And don't get me wrong, over the years I have heard landlords who will actively discriminate against benefits tenancies, but there's such a big gap between the local housing allowance and the market rent. The price does the discrimination, the market does the discrimination. So there's no need to consider any of that. ultimately it's being done by market forces, that discrimination that's not discrimination, it's just supply and demand apart from anything else. So all that money that's going out the door could stop going out the door if those homes were built. There is a business case to do that, right? You could do it by issuing inflation-linked bonds, which might be quite popular if you were very specific about the purpose of doing it, right? Then you've got a problem if you create more inflation because those homes cost more money. But of course, in the broader way, what those homes should do is also create and stimulate economic growth. If that happens and it trickles down in as much as when people have got more stable housing, when people have got more affordable housing, the economy does better because the people who are on restricted incomes like that at the low to middle income family level will save more money on rent and spend more money, therefore, out in the economy on essentials, but also on luxury goods. And all of this is what drives growth forward. So there is a business case to do it. The government have been too scared to make that business case. And so far, Rachel Reeves has put $3 billion towards affordable housing in the last budget. So even by my lowest possible estimate of 500,000 homes, which would mean the private sector was building 1 million, which looks difficult but possible over the next 5 years. It's probably lower than that. So we would still see that sort of take my lower end of my cash estimate, 125 billion. We've had 3 billion, so we're 122 billion short. And this is what I know to be true in detail, and you can ask any number of industry insiders who were willing to speak, all the way up to directors of public limited companies, all the way down to individual house builders, property developers, builders. Anyone who's got half a clue will tell you this is not even all of the problem, because partially some of the problem is having the number of people to build it and the number of materials. I'm only talking about the money. I'm not even talked about sites with planning and all the rest of it. And obviously planning is being addressed, but how quickly will that change things? It takes a couple of years usually for a scheme to get from concept all the way through, and the planning laws aren't through yet. So this is an impossibility in a 5-year parliament, and that's the silly part of their target. What they would have been much better off to do is be very honest and say, we will be able to start the ball rolling such that by the end of the parliament, we will be building 300,000 homes a year. There's a tiny, tiny possibility of being able to do that. I think they'd have been better to say 250, because that still would have been a great achievement. But they've set this incredible stretch goal. They're convinced they're going to do it, and I'm convinced they've got no chance. And they'll realise they've got no chance. And I don't know how Angela Rayner will process that when she finally does get her head around it. She doesn't strike me as someone who gives up easily. But when there are, technical impossibilities due to lack of funding and all the other reasons that I mentioned, she probably will do. So that sort of has taken us all the way through from what the state of play is with the Chancellor, the bond yields, the comparison between Reeves and Truss, whether she should stay or she should go, and the situation in the UK housing market as far as the government's very ambitious house building targets have been set. The biggest issue, and there's just been a very sensible comment from Daniel there in terms of, with no economic growth for business, and remember this is a party that got elected by saying growth, growth, growth. That was their 3 words. That was their strap line. Ultimately, there's a significant problem. I'm not worried about the base rate higher than the ECB rate, Daniel. To be honest with you, the ECB rate has been lower than ours by at least 1% for a significant length of time, even when rates were 0.5%, 0.25%, 0.1. The ECB were at minus 0.75. So there is a differential in Europe, but there's also a very different approach in investing in the UK, because aside from Germany and France, and to a lesser extent Spain and Italy, you've got good rule of law, you've got an English-speaking nation, you've got fantastic university system. A lot of those can't keep up with it. Germany's struggling massively at the moment with the change in the cost of energy prices, partially Russia-Ukraine, partially Western world's drive towards net zero. Completely different subject, different video. There may be one day on that one. The economics of that are very interesting, and the economics of self-harm that goes on around that are quite interesting, unfortunately, as well. So that's where we are. So you can't say growth, 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 and then bring growth to a halt. But do remember this. Growth doesn't just come from the private sector. We in the private sector navel gaze a little bit sometimes and think that it does. Growth comes by growth in government spending, right? It also comes by improving export markets. Now, as the pound gets cheaper, our export markets unfortunately they have to work harder to achieve the same results. So that works against us if we've got a weak currency. So we do need to be aware of that. But of course, we then might do more volume because it gets cheaper for people, and it's cheaper in our currency. But everything we import, and because we're net importers, costs us more pounds. And so when they go on the supermarket shelves, we have to pay higher prices for them, which doesn't help consumers because it's inflationary. Higher inflation will keep interest rates higher for longer. But the reality of the world we live in today is 3% inflation is, if it's not the target, the stated target, which of course it isn't technically, it is the real world we live in, 3% inflation. So I think we need to get used to it. And when the bonds do get used to that, that means we're stuck in a world where we've got an interest rate at 4% or so, 4.25%, 4.5%, 5%, something between those two ranges. Just to close, I will say at the moment, residential mortgages are being stress tested at 8% interest rate. That's quite unlikely, really quite unlikely. So I'm not sure why we're stress testing all the way up there. Somebody again could do with the FCA/PRA making a more sensible decision. Well, it would be the FCA making a more sensible decision around where that rate should be, the stress testing rate, because it's too high. Because apart from anything else, if we start to approach anywhere near that level, there'll be a bit of a debt meltdown, and it won't happen. So why are we stress testing at 8? We could stress test at 7 or 7.5. That would make a difference to how many people can buy houses, which would help with supply and demand and bring house builders back to the market. If you're going to achieve 1.5 million and you need 1 million from the private sector, anyone can tell you that's 2/3, right? So you better make that private sector be able to deliver those 2/3, and you better work on getting the money to deliver the other 1/3. And the way you could do that is by being honest with the people in the first place about temporary accommodation, about housing benefit, about the problems, about, councils should have strong balance sheets. It would be good for all the local authorities if there's strong balance sheets, because if people have got affordable housing, it helps local businesses, right? Because people have got more money to go out and spend on leisure, on whatever, right? And this is what we need. But that's the nature of the beast. Please don't think there's an equivalence between Liz Truss and Rachel Reeves. It's not helping the UK by going around propagating that sort of stuff. Please don't think Liz Truss is absolved of what she did with her and Kwasi Kwarteng's budget. It was textbook disgrace when it happened. It still is. It was terrible behaviour. It can't be encouraged, and we cannot see the return or the encouragement of that sort of politics in the UK. So that's where I'll leave it. Thanks to everyone for tuning in, and thanks for your comments. And I'll see you again on Sunday, if not before.